Images are everywhere, and they're moving everywhere. We're living in a world where really one wants to somehow question what are the tides of globalization by, in a way, posing the question that an artist might pose. And that might be trying to question the way that those images may come about in certain locations. I was born in London in 1960. My parents immigrated from St. Lucia at the end of the 50s. The inspiration for making art really began in the East End of London, where I grew up, because I was very fortunate to live in a street where artists live.
What do we want? Jobs! We don't want land! What don't we want? Jobs!
I began really my sort of artistic practice when I went to St. Martin's School of Art, which was between 1980 and 1984.
We want justice! We want justice!
By the time I was 20 at St. Martin's School of Art, I already knew that I wanted to make films. I already knew that I was very interested in the moving image.
The 12th of January 1983, Colin Roach found dead in Stoke Newington Police Station.
St. Martin's School of Art was really very instrumental because the course I attended was a very special course. I studied painting, sculpture and photography and was very interested in a certain interdisciplinary approach to making art.
How far should we go to begin our story, a history of carnival? To 1976, to 1966, or to 1959? Or should we turn to its origins in the Caribbean, in Africa, in ancient Babylon, centuries before Christ?
I graduated in 1984. It was a very politically intense time and also a creative, cultural time as well in London.
A new context for the political struggles of the disseminated mass of unwanted labour is provided by the streets of civil society. Its territories, the contradictory spaces which are the geographical expressions of a city. The territories of class, labour, race, sex, relations.
And the identity that I'm searching for in looking for Langston is really the question of a black gay desire. Where would that be located in history?
You run around with funny people.
I was very interested in trying to make a silent film utilising black and white photography to pose certain poetic questions of desire.
Way to three. There was a time when I was alone, my freakish way to three. But they're so common now, you get one every day in a week.
I think works rather well in terms of making images which are kind of more imagistic in nature and in a way poses questions which are not as didactical as they would be in a kind of more political register.
I wondered as you wandered, and I've seen how far you've come. Though history's forgotten names.
It's really connected to these concerns of how one marries the poetic to the political and vice versa. It's a film which is about mourning the dead. It was made at a time when AIDS was very much in for sort of stride, a time when lots of people that I knew were dying.
A person does not lightly elect to oppose his society. One would much rather be at home among one's compatriots than be mocked and detested by them.
Trying to utilise the poems of Langston Hughes was really part of trying to form a certain visual vocabulary, a vocabulary which was located in the ways in which we're trying to think or rethink cinema in Britain in the late 1980s.
In the dark, we don't have to say, I love you. The dark swallows it and sighs like we sigh when we rise from our knees.
For me, the relationship to sort of poetry is very important because it's a way of trying to have a more lyrical approach to making images.
I was born in 1925 in Martinique. I studied medicine in France and later specialized in psychiatry. When I was 27, I published my first book, Black Skins, White Masks. Why write this book? No one has asked me for it, especially those to whom it is directed.
There are lots of people who, in the cinema, think about there being a separation between documentary and fiction. I personally don't really separate the two categories of filmmaking because all of those ways of making films are connected to constructing films within certain genres. All of the films are constructions. It's just that we have been familiarised with them as representing certain ways of, if you like, telling stories in one genre which may be deemed more appropriate and not for the other. So in my works, I'm very much interested in trying to, in a way, deliberately confuse these two genre expectations. As a way of trying to question the ways in which we might want to look at certain periods through certain aesthetical sort of forms or regime.
I came into this world imbued with the need to find a meaning in things. My spirit was filled with the desire to get to the very source of the world.
The Frantz Fanon film really develops out of a whole interest in cultural studies, which I was very much involved in the mid-90s. For me, that's really connected to just trying to, in a way, throw things up, in a way, mess things up a little, have a bit of fun.
Let me observe at once that I had no opportunity to establish the overt presence of homosexuality in Martinique.
And I think that way of making films can be quite disarming and at the same time disturbing for certain audiences, but I think at the same time perhaps creates a certain curiosity about how you may approach certain subject matters. Frantz Fanon, who grew up in Martinique, was a brilliant student, went to Paris and then basically went to Algeria as a doctor and became involved in the sort of Arab revolution that took place there. Certainly in the latter part of the film, its concentration on the relationship between colonial wars and mental disorders. So if you think about Algeria, if you think about Syria, if you think about all of those spaces, Fanon was posing really important questions in his time in the 60s, and I think this history has certainly come to haunt the present.
My final prayer. O my body, make of me always a man who questions.
I remember the sea. I remember the garden. I remember the cottage. But most of all, I remember you. Dear Derek.
Derek, it was a film, because of its biographical nature, as being quite contemporary. Derek Jarman, who died in 1994 of AIDS, it was something that was quite challenging, and I think also very important, because there's a way in which I think the distant, or not too distant past, is always very difficult to represent.
My parents got married in 1940. It was March the 30th. Apparently it was the day when the most marriages happened in the 40s. Someone told me this.
It was very interesting to be able to utilise Derek's interview that Colin McCabe made in 1990.
Whether people liked the film or not, they all liked that. They all came to see that. So maybe it was a film that people just came to see that.
So Derek could, as it were, speak literally almost from the grave. Derek's cinema, it was always very important as a barometer for challenging the status quo.
But it's something like 7 years since you made your last film. Why the gap?
Well, I just think the British cinema has no idea of including the auteurs and the oddballs like myself, and actually allowing us to grow into the mainstream of the cinema.
The kind of cinema that Derek Jarman represented at that particular time is one of them that I think that the film industry in Britain worked quite hard to sort of get rid of this notion of independent filmmaking. I'm interested in biography because I'm interested in history. I'm interested in looking at certain historical figures as a way of really trying to think about the present. There's a way in which we try to separate the present from the past, but the present is haunted by the past. It's interesting, if one thinks about my work, that there are perhaps quite a few ghosts around.
Our souls scatter across the ocean.
I don't always believe our actions are our own. I think they are kind of monitored by previous events. But I don't think about that any superstitious man. I just think about that as a kind of, let's call it historical baggage. The use of sound, the use of the rhythmic way perhaps the images are working. All of these are the components which are in a way trying to evoke this other way of thinking which may not be connected to certain forms of rationality. In the question of the poetics of making images, that you're always interested in trying to question those ways of thinking which seem to be kind of normal or normative.
From the great North Wales Sea.
If there's ghosts, it's to do with the way that sound works in the work. One of the things around making films involved in a structuralist filmmaking course is the idea of thinking about image and sound in a non-diegetic manner. You don't have the literal correspondence between sound and image. If you're trying to do that and at the same time tell a story, there's a very innovative approach that you can make films, thinking about the way that you edit films, thinking about the rhythm, the way that you edit a work, and how that, in a way, creates meaning and also creates a certain feeling. There's a kind of real rhythmic aspect, I think, that I was able to bring out of structuralist filmmaking to my own practice, and to marry that with some of my other cultural interests, which were beyond structuralist filmmaking. My interest in making cinema derived really from the notion of choreography. I was very interested in movement. The idea of movement, the idea of being able to tell a story through pictures, the question of how you shoot a sort of action and how you tell a story through images is something I was really very interested in, and one of the things I wanted to develop, because I was really interested in a language which was a kind of silent cinema language, not dependent on the spoken word. One of the things which was really interesting for me as a sort of challenge was really to think about where was innovation taking place in the cinema.
I think I am the first man to sit on top of the
And when I lived in New York in the mid-90s, it became very clear to me that the certain experiments which were taking place in the gallery context. The difference between making films and moving image works in the gallery is really connected to a certain autonomy or freedom. To my mind, it became very interesting to think about a more sculptural relationship to the image, thinking about how one could then bring narrative to play, or non-narrative images to play, across many screens, and that could be a new way, perhaps, of experiencing the moving image. I think in my own career it's quite interesting to think about this question of being in between, as it were, the sort of black box and the white cube. When we go to the gallery, the relationship to concentration in terms of looking at moving image works, to a certain extent, it's less. So I wanted to make the challenge for myself to make works that would somehow change that sort of way in which audiences might look at works in that context. The connection to a certain notion of trying to seduce the audience with certain ways of filming, trying to input different ways of aesthetics and different ways of pictorial interventions into those spaces that might, in a way, radically reframe them, trying to break rules of really not adhering to the kind of classical kind of paradigms that you get in these contexts, and to break open the white cube, also kind of challenge the sort of orthodoxies of the kind of black box in relationship to the kind of more theatrical context. There's quite a lot of double standards at work, I think, in the way in which we're placing in one context, in a high cultural context, sort of the ways in which you should be looking at images, which obviously should be more critical, and that of the popular context, where there's a less criticality, there's more of the relationship to entertainment, to pleasure. I'm just really interested in trying to confuse those things deliberately, posing different sorts of questions in each one. I'm very interested in looking at different locations in the geopoetics or the geocultural geography of the world. I'm really interested in trying to reclaim that in my work, but at the same time reworking it from a different subjective position. I'm often thinking about location and landscape in a symbolic sense. I like this idea of mistaken identities.
To be entombed in ice.
And the locations, how it portray this sort of relationship.
Or to drop from starvation is all in the game.
I think in my own work I'm very interested in trying to create a certain provocation and at the same time to seduce the audience. There's this kind of attraction and also pull away. There are works that I've made that when I look at them even now, sometimes they're kind of uncomfortable. I think that's really important. But at the same time, something that can be quite enchanting. You know, having both those things are very important aspects of making work for me. I enjoy the idea of taking risk in the work. To do that, there is a certain attitude, perhaps, that one has to adopt. I can make a very interesting work, it could be quite provocative, it could be playing within the codes of a certain convention of how things would be made that could be accepted by certain norms. I think I'm very interested in trying to challenge those norms.
We know the tolls: 23, Rockaway, New York; 58, Dover, England; 18, Shenzhen; 25, South Korea, and many more. We know the methods: walk, swim, fly, metal container, back of a lorry, ship's hold. We know how they died: starved, raped, dehydrated, drowned, suffocated, homesick, heartsick, worked to death, working to death. We know we may end in the same boat.